The grand hall of the Valerian palace was filled with glowing blue lights, floating ribbons of energy, and tall alien nobles dressed in shimmering robes. Their eyes, narrow and bright, followed every movement with cold curiosity. In the center of this magnificent place stood a lone human soldier, Sergeant Mason Hale, wearing heavy Earth military armor that looked dull compared to the colorful alien designs around him. He stood firm, his back straight, his hands behind him, saying nothing as he waited for the negotiations to begin. Humans had come a long way to form peace with the Valerians. After years of border misunderstandings and small conflicts, both sides finally agreed that unity would be better than repeating old mistakes. Mason had been chosen as the human representative's personal guard because he was known for discipline, calmness, and unusual strength for a human. He had no idea that this day would turn into something very different. When the tall doors opened, every alien bowed their head respectfully as the young Valerian princess entered. Princess Ryla was 19 in her species years, which made her equivalent to a young adult. She wore a shining dress made from thread-like crystal layers, and her silver hair floated around her like mist. Her expression was confident, almost too confident, and when her eyes landed on Mason, they paused for a moment, not with interest, but with amusement. She walked slowly to her throne seat, then turned to face the hall. Her voice echoed like soft bells as she spoke, and the nobles around her smiled and nodded as if every word she said was a treasure. But when she looked again at Mason, her lips curved into a smirk. "So," she said loudly enough for the hall to hear, "this is the human soldier your people chose to send us?" The Valerian nobles chuckled. Mason remained still, saying nothing. He was trained to ignore insults, but there was something sharp and targeted in her tone. Princess Ryla walked closer to him, circling him as if examining an object in a market. She tapped her long fingernails against the metal of his armor with a light tink. Her face twisted into playful disgust. "Is this thick metal supposed to impress us? Humans must be very fragile creatures if they need to hide inside such heavy shells." A few nobles laughed louder. Mason didn't move. Ryla continued, "How do you even walk in this? It looks uncomfortable. Perhaps humans fear a simple scratch. Or maybe you are simply not strong enough to stand without support?" Her voice held no real curiosity. It was all mockery, smooth and clear. Some aliens whispered jokes, others nodded, enjoying their princess's confidence. Mason knew he had done nothing to deserve this, but he also understood that showing anger would make things worse. He kept his eyes straight ahead. But Princess Ryla wasn't done. She tilted her head and spoke even more boldly. "Tell me, human, do all your warriors hide behind armor? Or only the weak ones?" This time, the laughter was loud enough to fill the entire hall. Even the guards at the sides hid small smiles behind their helmets. Mason's throat tightened, but he took a slow breath. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. He had come here with respect, hoping their species could work together. He had expected curiosity or caution, not humiliation, but he also remembered something important. Humans were not defined by what others said. They were defined by what they did. Without a word, Mason lifted his hands to the sides of his helmet. Everyone fell silent. The clicking sound of the seals unlocking echoed through the hall. Slowly, he lifted his helmet off and placed it gently on the floor. Some aliens frowned, confused. Others leaned forward to see what he was doing. He reached for the chest locks next. A heavier clank followed as that piece came off too, then the arm guards, then the leg plates. Each piece hit the floor with a deep metallic thud. The nobles stopped laughing. Their eyes widened as the human soldier removed every layer of armor piece by piece. Princess Ryla stepped back slightly, her confidence wavering for the first time. She had expected anger or excuses, not silent action. She hadn't expected him to strip away the very protection she mocked. When Mason stood in only his basic uniform, simple fabric, nothing reinforced, he lifted his armor helmet one last time, placed it gently on top of the pile, and stepped away from it. The whole hall watched him. Mason didn't bow. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply turned around and began walking toward the exit. Princess Ryla's eyes widened. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer. "Stop!" she commanded, her voice rising. "You cannot leave this hall without permission." But Mason kept walking. A few alien guards stepped forward as if to block him, but the princess silently raised her hand. She didn't know why, but something told her not to interfere. Something about the human's calm, silent departure felt heavier than any insult she had thrown. The hall remained silent except for the steady footsteps of the human soldier. When he pushed open the large doors and walked out into the bright courtyard, the nobles began murmuring with confusion. One whispered, "Is he surrendering?" Another replied, "Or is it some human ritual?" Someone else said, "Maybe he is weak after all." Princess Ryla heard all of it, but she didn't respond. She felt a strange pressure in her chest. It wasn't fear, it wasn't guilt, not yet. It was something new, uncertainty. Humans were supposed to be loud, emotional, unpredictable. But this one had shown nothing except quiet dignity. Her advisor approached her. "Princess, shall we bring him back? Shall we punish him for disrespect?" She shook her head slowly. "No. Let him walk." "Why, princess?" She didn't know how to explain it. She only said, "Because he didn't challenge me. He didn't defend himself with words. He simply left." She looked down at the pile of armor still lying on the polished floor. The lights reflected across the metal surface, but something about it seemed heavier now. It felt like a message. A silent message humans didn't need to speak aloud. Outside the hall, Mason walked past the palace gates into the open plains of the Valerian world. The planet was known for dangerous creatures and unpredictable weather. Humans usually never traveled without armor. Everyone watching from the palace expected him to stop or turn back. But Mason didn't. He walked forward across unfamiliar soil, breathing the alien air, looking ahead without fear. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew why he left. Respect was something he offered freely, but not something he accepted being denied in return. Inside the palace, Princess Ryla kept staring at the doorway he had walked through. She tried to tell herself she didn't care, that a human soldier's pride meant nothing. But the hall felt strangely cold now. The laughter she had started earlier no longer felt victorious. It felt small. She whispered quietly to herself, "What kind of species walks away like that? What kind of strength is that?" Her advisor answered, "Humans, princess. They are different." Far beyond the palace walls, Mason disappeared into the horizon, his figure growing smaller with every step. He had no armor, no weapon, and no plan. But he had something far more powerful, a human spirit that refused to bow, refused to be mocked, and refused to break. Whatever happened next, the princess would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Mason walked away from the palace until its tall crystal towers faded behind him. The sky above the Valerian world shifted colors slowly, glowing blue, then violet, then silver as the winds moved across the atmosphere. The ground beneath him was covered with thick, soft grass that sparkled faintly like dusted frost. Everything about this world felt strange, but Mason kept his steps steady. He had no armor now, no heavy suit to protect him, but he did not regret leaving it behind. Inside the palace, Princess Ryla watched the distant figure through a large window. Her hands were pressed together in front of her, her expression unreadable. She had expected humans to be proud or foolish, but this human silence made her uneasy. She wanted to laugh it off, to call him dramatic, But something inside her kept repeating the same thought. No alien she had ever met would walk into the wild lands unprotected. Her advisor walked up beside her. "Your Highness, the human will not last long out there." She did not answer him immediately. She stared at Mason's shrinking silhouette. "How long do humans survive on their own? Without their machines? Without armor?" "Not long," the advisor answered confidently. But Princess Ryla wasn't sure anymore. Out on the plains, Mason kept walking until he reached a cluster of tall, thin trees. Their bark glowed faint orange, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. He touched one lightly with his fingertips. The bark felt warm. He moved around them, searching for a place to set up a temporary camp. He had been trained for situations like this, situations where he had to rely only on his body and his mind. He found a spot near a low hill, partly sheltered by rocks. Good enough. He gathered fallen branches from the glowing trees, snapped off some dry vines, and twisted them together. After a few tries, he had a makeshift shelter. It wasn't beautiful, but it was strong. Far away in the palace, Princess Ryla received a report from her surveillance officers. They showed her a floating screen with the human soldier's movements. She watched him build the shelter slowly, piece by piece. The officers were confused. "He is surviving without tools," one of them said. "Is this normal for humans?" Princess Ryla didn't know what to say. Back on the plains, Mason sat down under his shelter and took a deep breath. The air was cold and sharp, and he could smell something strange, like burning metal. He looked around. There was no fire, no smoke. Then he remembered what his briefing had said about Valerian wildlife. The smell of metal meant a predator was near. He stood up slowly, listening. A soft crunch echoed from behind the rocks, then another. Mason scanned the area carefully until he saw it. A creature twice his size, with long legs and a body covered in blue-black scales. Its eyes glowed yellow. It let out a low hiss that sounded more curious than aggressive, but Mason knew better. The creature stepped closer. Mason grabbed the longest branch he had. It wasn't a weapon, but it was something. The creature hissed again, opening its mouth to reveal a row of small, sharp teeth. Mason lifted the branch and shouted loudly. The creature paused, surprised by the sudden noise. Mason took a step forward, swinging the branch just close enough to create a gust of air. The creature backed up slightly, but didn't leave. Mason grabbed a handful of small stones and threw them toward the creature's feet. The stones hit the ground with sharp taps, and the creature flinched. It hissed again, but this time it turned and ran off. Mason dropped his arm and exhaled slowly. Humans were not the strongest species, but they were stubborn, and stubbornness was sometimes enough to survive. Meanwhile, Princess Ryla watched the entire scene through the palace screens. She leaned forward, surprised. She hadn't expected the human to stand against a plains predator without armor or energy weapons. She had always believed humans relied on technology because they were weak, but now she wasn't so sure. She asked the surveillance officer, "Why did he not run?" "Humans rarely run from threats," the officer replied. "They prefer to face them. It is strange." Princess Ryla felt heat rise in her cheeks. She remembered how boldly she had mocked him earlier. She realized she had judged him too quickly, based on assumptions and pride, but she still didn't know how to feel about it. As the night came, the sky turned darker than ink, dotted with floating blue orbs that drifted like fireflies. Mason built a small fire using the warm bark of the glowing trees. The flame flickered with a soft blue shade instead of red. He sat next to it, warming his hands. Hours passed, and the princess continued watching him. She didn't want to, but she couldn't stop. Every time he survived a challenge, another part of her pride cracked. She wasn't angry anymore. She was curious. Why would a human soldier choose to walk out alone instead of fighting back? Why did he accept humiliation quietly instead of shouting in anger? Why did he risk his life so easily? She wanted answers, but the only one who could give them was the man she had chased away. The next morning, Mason woke early and stretched his arms. His muscles ached, but he was used to discomfort. He checked the horizon and saw storm clouds rolling in, thick and heavy. Valerian storms were dangerous, filled with strong winds and pulse lightning that could knock out electronics. The storm would strike within an hour. Mason took down his shelter quickly and tied the vines and branches into a pack. He needed high ground to stay safe. He climbed the nearest hill, gripping rocks and pulling himself up. The wind grew stronger, pushing against him. The storm wasn't normal. The clouds twisted like moving shadows. When the first crack of pulse lightning struck, Mason dropped to the ground and covered his head. The light flashed so brightly it blinded him for several seconds. He crawled behind a large boulder as more bolts struck nearby. He breathed slowly, focusing on staying calm. The palace screens shook with static as the storm covered the area where the human was. Princess Ryla leaned forward anxiously. "Is he still alive?" she asked. "We do not know," the officer replied. "The storm interferes with our sensors." The princess looked down at her hands. She hadn't realized she was trembling until that moment. Mason held on to the rock as another bolt hit the ground only meters away. The earth shook. His ears rang. But he did not panic. When the lightning slowed, he moved to a higher point. He grabbed onto rock edges with scraped fingers, pulling himself upward. When he reached the top of the hill, he looked out across the land and saw something far worse than the storm. He saw movement, unnatural movement. Machines, not Valerian machines, moved through the valley with slow, silent steps. They were dark, sharp, and shaped like weapons. Mason narrowed his eyes. These were not storm markers or wildlife. They were raider drones, and if drones were here, then raiders were close. Back at the palace, Princess Ryla finally received a clear signal again. The screen showed the human standing on the hill, staring at something. "What is he looking at?" she whispered. The officer zoomed in. Machines. Many machines. Ryla's eyes widened. Those are not ours." Her advisor rushed in when he heard the news. "Princess, those machines belong to the border raiders. They must have entered our lands during the storm." Ryla felt a chill in her chest. "They are heading toward the capital." The advisor nodded. Yes, and the first one to see them was the human. The princess swallowed hard. She had mocked him. She had insulted him. She had chased him away. And now he was the only one standing in the path of danger. She looked at Mason on the screen again, standing calmly on the hill as the machines approached. For the first time, she whispered with genuine worry, "What is he going to do?" The answer was simple. He was going to survive, and he was going to protect everyone, even the ones who had mocked him. The wind still roared around Mason as he stood on the hilltop, staring down at the valley where the raider machines moved in large numbers. The storm clouds above were thinning, and thin beams of pale sunlight cut through the sky. The machines appeared like dark shadows, walking slowly and silently across the land. Their metal frames were sharp and angular, unlike anything Valerians used. Mason crouched low, observing them carefully. He counted at least 30 drones. Raiders didn't send that many unless they were preparing for a large-scale attack. He knew the Valerian capital was only a few hours away. If the palace guards were caught unprepared, the damage would be terrible. He took a slow breath. He could return to the palace and warn them, but that would take too long on foot. And if the raiders saw him running, they might launch their attack early. He needed to understand the situation first. He needed to find their base. Mason climbed down the hill, staying low between rocks and tall grass. He followed the movement of the machines, keeping out of sight. He moved quietly, careful not to disturb the glowing plants or step on brittle branches that might alert the sensors. The raider machines were scanning the area, sweeping beams of red light across the ground. Mason pressed himself against a boulder until the light passed over, just inches from his foot. Meanwhile, in the palace, Princess Ryla paced back and forth in front of the large viewing screen. Her silver hair floated slightly behind her, reacting to her anxious movements. The hall was filled with murmurs from nobles and guards who had gathered to watch the human soldiers feed. Her advisor approached her again. "Princess, should we send soldiers to retrieve him?" Ryla shook her head. "If we send a group, the raiders will notice. They may attack early. But if he is caught alone—" "He will not allow himself to be caught," Ryla said quietly. Her voice held no mockery this time, only respect and worry. The feed crackled as the storm clouds cleared more and the sensors regained strength. The image of Mason on the screen became clearer. The nobles leaned in, surprised by his calmness in such danger. "He is following the raider machines," one guard said. "Why?" a noblewoman asked. Ryla answered without hesitation. "To find out what their plan is." Out in the wild plains, Mason pressed forward. He eventually reached the edge of a small canyon where the ground sloped downward. From there, he saw a hidden camp nestled between the rocky walls. Dozens of raider soldiers, armored and armed, moved around inside. Their ships were camouflaged, blending into the dark rocks. Mason observed quietly. The raiders were not preparing to invade. They were waiting. Probably for a signal. Probably for the perfect moment when the Valerians were most vulnerable. Mason narrowed his eyes. He spotted a communication tower on the far side of the camp. It stood taller than the ships, with red lights blinking at its top. That tower was the heart of their operation. If the tower fell, the raider communication network would collapse. They would be thrown into confusion. That could give the Valerians enough time to prepare, but Mason had no armor. No weapons, no backup. He took a slow breath. He had been in worse situations before. He trusted his training, and he trusted his instincts. He scanned the canyon walls. There was a narrow crack that led downward in a twisting path. It was steep, but it offered cover. He moved quietly, slipping through the shadows. Every step he took was careful. Every breath was controlled. He could hear the distant hum of machines and the murmur of raider voices. When he reached the bottom, he hid behind a cargo crate, watching the guards' movements. The raiders were aliens, tall with dark skin and long, armored limbs. They carried pulse rifles that glowed with steady energy. Their helmets were smooth and reflective, making it impossible to see their faces. Mason stayed still until he understood their patrol pattern. He waited for the right moment. When one guard turned away, Mason moved like a shadow, slipping behind another crate. When a patrol passed nearby, he held his breath until they walked away. Step by step, he moved closer to the communication tower. Inside the Valerian palace, Princess Ryla watched the feed with wide eyes. Every time Mason moved, she felt her chest tighten. Every time he hid, she held her breath. She didn't understand why she felt this way. She barely knew the human. She had mocked him only yesterday. Yet now she felt more concern for him than she ever expected. Her advisor whispered, "Your Highness, the human is attempting to infiltrate the raider camp." "I can see that," she whispered back. Her voice shook slightly. "But why alone? Why risk himself for us?" The advisor had no answer. Mason reached the tower's base. The large metal structure hummed with energy. The control terminal was guarded by 2 raiders. He needed a distraction. He picked up a small rock from the ground and threw it toward a stack of metal crates behind the guards. The sound echoed sharply. Both guards snapped their heads in that direction and walked away to investigate. Mason moved quickly, reaching the terminal. He examined the controls. They were complex, but not unfamiliar. In missions past, he had learned how to overload enemy systems. He tapped a series of commands on the panel. The screen blinked red. A warning flashed. "System overload in 30 seconds." Mason turned and ran. Inside the tower, the energy beams began to flicker. The red lights blinked rapidly. The raiders shouted when they realized something was wrong. Panic spread quickly. As Mason sprinted across the canyon, the tower gave off a loud, cracking sound. The energy core inside began shaking violently. He dove behind a rock just as the tower exploded in a bright burst of white light. The shockwave threw dust and debris into the air. Raider soldiers stumbled and shouted in confusion. Their drones in the valley stopped moving, freezing mid-step. The entire raider operation fell into chaos. Princess Ryla flinched when the explosion lit up the palace viewing screen. Did he destroy it?" The officer nodded. "Yes, Princess. He destroyed the communication tower." "But did he survive?" Ryla whispered. The screen flickered as dust cleared. Then the image became clear again. Mason was alive. He stood up slowly from behind the rock, coughing and dust-covered but unharmed. The nobles in the hall let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Ryla closed her eyes for a moment, relief washing through her. Back in the canyon, Mason saw the raiders scrambling. They had no way to coordinate now. Their attack on the capital was no longer possible. But he wasn't finished yet. He climbed up the canyon wall, ignoring the pain in his legs and arms. When he reached the top, he saw the drones still frozen in the valley. Their lights flickered weakly. He walked toward the nearest drone, looked at its power core, and smashed the small override panel with a rock. Sparks flew, and the machine collapsed. He moved to the next, and the next. One by one, he disabled them, preventing them from restarting. Princess Ryla watched in stunned silence. She had never seen such determination, such stubborn courage. She had mocked him, she had been arrogant, but this man, this human, acted with honor that even Valerian warriors rarely showed. When Mason finished disabling the drones, he turned toward the palace in the distance. He began walking back, tired but unbroken. Princess Ryla whispered something no one expected to hear. "I was wrong about him." Her advisor stood beside her quietly. "Many of us were, Princess." She looked at the screen one last time, watching Mason move slowly across the plains. "No," she said softly. "Only I insulted him. Only I hurt him, and yet he saved us." She straightened her back, her eyes firm. "I will meet him at the gates when he returns." And for the first time, she felt something new, something powerful, toward the human soldier she once mocked. The journey back to the palace was long, and Mason's steps grew slower with each mile. His uniform was torn, his hands were scraped, and dust clung to his skin like a second layer. The explosion had shaken him, the climb had exhausted him, and the fight for survival had pushed his mind and body to their limits. But he continued walking because that was what he knew. Keep moving, keep going, no matter what. The Valerian sun was rising now, glowing bright silver. The sky slowly shifted from violet to pale gold. The wind was cool and gentle, brushing across Mason's face. Every breath he took hurt a little, but he didn't complain. He had done what needed to be done. At the palace, tension filled the grand hall. Princess Ryla stood on the high balcony overlooking the plains, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had barely slept. She had barely spoken. Every minute, she asked the officers for updates. Every minute, they told her the same thing. The human was still on his way. He had survived the raiders. He had survived the storm. He had destroyed their communication tower and stopped a full attack. But even after all of that, Ryla wasn't at peace. Not until she saw him with her own eyes. Her advisor stepped beside her. "Princess, the guards are ready to escort you. Shall we go meet him?" Ryla nodded slowly. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Yes, I will not hide behind walls." A small transport platform floated forward, and she stepped onto it along with two guards. They moved out through the palace gates and hovered above the ground, gliding smoothly across the plain. As they approached the horizon, one of the guards pointed forward. "There," he said. At first, Ryla saw only a small figure. But as they moved closer, the figure became clearer. Mason was walking with slow determination, one hand clutching his side. Even from a distance, she could see how tired he was. When the platform landed near him, Mason stopped walking. He blinked against the bright light as the princess stepped down. She approached him carefully, unsure how to begin. Mason straightened, trying to look composed, even though exhaustion weighed on him. Princess Ryla stood only a few steps away from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind carried soft sounds of distant wildlife, and the sunlight reflected off the silver accents of her dress. Finally, Ryla spoke. Her voice was softer than anyone in the palace had ever heard from her. "You came back." Mason nodded once. "Yes. You destroyed the tower." "You stopped the raiders." Her voice trembled slightly. "You saved us." Mason breathed slowly. It had to be done. Ryla looked at him closely. He didn't stand like someone expecting praise or reward. He didn't even seem to think he had done something special. He just looked calm, steady, as if he had simply completed another task. Ryla felt a tightening in her throat. She had insulted this man. She had laughed at him. And still, he risked his life to protect her people. She took a deep breath. "Sergeant Mason Hale, I must say something to you. Something I should have said long ago." Mason held her gaze politely, waiting. "I was wrong," she said, her voice breaking a little. "I judged you without knowing you. I spoke harshly. I treated you with disrespect. And yet, you did not return anger. You did not fight back with words. Instead, you chose actions, actions that protected my people and my home." She bowed her head. "I am sorry." The guards behind her exchanged shocked looks. A Valerian princess apologizing to a human. None of them had ever seen such a thing. Mason looked at her for a moment. Then he spoke in the same simple tone he always used. "You spoke with pride, princess. Many leaders do. But your people were in danger. I couldn't ignore that." "But why?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "Why help us after everything I said to you?" Mason looked out toward the horizon for a moment before answering. "Because respect is not something I give only when I receive it. And because peace matters, lives matter. If I had walked away fully, people would have died." He looked at her again. "I chose the right thing, not the easy thing." Ryla felt her chest tighten again, but this time it wasn't worry, it was admiration. She nodded slowly. "I see now what kind of strength humans carry. It is not in their armor. It is in their spirit." Mason gave a small, tired smile. Ryla stepped closer, her expression gentler than before. "You cannot walk any farther in your condition. Come with me. The palace doctors will treat your wounds." Mason hesitated. "I'm fine." "No, you are not," she said firmly, but not unkindly. "Please." The word please surprised him, so he nodded. Ryla gestured for him to step onto the platform. He moved slowly, every movement stiff with fatigue. When the platform lifted from the ground, Ryla stood beside him, watching him with quiet concern. As they returned to the palace, many Valerians gathered near the gates. When the floating platform arrived with Princess Ryla and Mason, whispers spread quickly. The nobles fell silent. The guards straightened, Some bowed their heads. They had watched the feed. They knew what he had done. Princess Ryla stepped forward and addressed the gathering. "This human," she said, her voice strong, "has saved our kingdom. He acted with courage, wisdom, and strength. He deserves our respect." The crowd bowed to Mason. He looked around, stunned by their reaction. He had never expected such a welcome. After the doctors examined him and wrapped his wounds, Ryla visited him in a quiet room overlooking the gardens. Mason sat on a soft bench, staring out at the glowing plants. He felt strange being surrounded by comfort after so much danger. Ryla entered slowly. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," Mason admitted. "But better." She sat near him, not too close, but close enough to show she wasn't afraid or distant anymore. For a moment she said nothing. Then she looked at him with sincere eyes. "I want to understand humans," she said. "I want to understand you. I thought strength came from power and pride, but you showed me something different." She paused. "Will you teach me?" Mason blinked. "Teach you?" "Yes," she said. "About resilience, about courage, about why humans act the way they do. I wish to learn." Mason thought for a few seconds, then nodded. "I can teach you, but not here." She tilted her head. "Then where?" He looked toward the wild plains outside the palace walls. "Out there, where there's no armor, no guards, no perfect safety. That's where you learn what strength truly is." Ryla hesitated for only a moment before she nodded with determination. "Then I will go with you." Her advisor nearly fainted when he overheard. "Princess, the wild lands are dangerous," Mason spoke before Ryla could. "Not dangerous if you respect them, and if you learn." Ryla looked at Mason with quiet confidence. "Prepare a small pack for me. I will go at sunrise." Her advisor looked helpless. "But your highness—" She raised her hand. "Enough. The human walked into the wild with nothing. I can walk with him." The next morning, when the first sunlight touched the land, Ryla stood at the palace gates wearing simple travel clothes instead of royal layers. She had a small pack, nothing more. Mason waited for her, steady and ready, though still recovering. She approached him. "Are we ready?" He nodded. "Let's go." They walked together into the wild lands, side by side. Mason moved carefully, showing her how to watch the ground, how to sense dangers, how to understand the land instead of fearing it. Ryla listened closely, absorbing everything. When a strange creature appeared, Mason taught her not to panic. When the wind shifted, he taught her how to read the weather. For the first time, the princess felt the world in a different way, raw, real, and alive. As they walked farther, Ryla realized something important. Humans did not need armor to be strong. They did not need loud words or shining titles. They carried strength quietly inside their hearts and showed it through action. And she felt herself changing step by step. By the end of the day, the princess finally understood why the human soldier had walked away from the palace. He had not walked away because he was weak. He had walked away to show what true strength looked like, and she was grateful he had. When night fell, they sat on a hilltop under the glowing sky. Mason built a small fire, and Ryla sat beside him, watching the blue flames dance. She looked at him softly. "Thank you for teaching me." Mason nodded quietly. "And thank you for learning." In that quiet moment, with no palace, no throne, and no armor between them, a new understanding formed, between a human soldier and an alien princess, a bridge stronger than any treaty, and from that day forward neither of them would ever see humanity or each other the same way again.